Chapter 3, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Cincinnati, 1832 through 1836, Part 1. Dr. Beecher called to Cincinnati, the westward journey, first letter from home, description of Walnut Hills, starting a new school, inward glimpses, the Semicolon Club, early impressions of slavery, a journey to the East, thoughts aroused by first visit to Niagara, marriage to Professor Stowe. In 1832, after having been settled for 6 years over the Hanover Street Church in Boston, Dr. Beecher received and finally accepted a most urgent call to become president of Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. This institution had been chartered in 1829, and in 1831 funds to the amount of nearly $70,000 had been promised to it, provided that Dr. Beecher accepted the presidency. It was hard for this New England family to sever the ties of a lifetime and enter on so long a journey to the far distant West of those days, but being fully persuaded that their duty lay in this direction, they undertook to perform it cheerfully and willingly. With Dr. Beecher and his wife were to go Miss Catherine Beecher, who had conceived the scheme of founding in Cincinnati, then considered the capital of the West, a female college, and Harriet, who was to act as her principal assistant. In the party were also George, who was to enter Lane as a student, Isabella, James the youngest son, and Miss Esther Beecher, the Aunt Esther of the children. Before making his final decision, Dr. Beecher, accompanied by his daughter Catherine, visited Cincinnati to take a general survey of their proposed battlefield, and their impressions of the city are given in the following letter written by the latter to Harriet in Boston. Quote, "Here we are at last at our journey's end, alive and well. We are staying with Uncle Samuel Foote, whose establishment I will try and sketch for you. It is on a height in the upper part of the city, and commands a fine view of the whole of the lower town. The city does not impress me as being so very new. It is true everything looks neat and clean, but it is compact, and many of the houses are of brick and handsomely built. The streets run at right angles to each other, and are wide and well paved. We reached here in 3 days from Wheeling, and soon found ourselves at home. The next day, father and I, with 3 gentlemen, walked out to Walnut Hills. The country around the city consists of a constant succession and variety of hills of all shapes and sizes, forming an extensive amphitheater. The site of the seminary is very beautiful and picturesque, though I was disappointed to find that both river and city are hidden by intervening hills. I never saw a place so capable of being rendered a paradise by the improvements of taste as the environs of this city. Walnut Hills are so elevated and cool that people have to leave there to be sick, it is said. The seminary is located on a farm of 125 acres of fine land, with groves of superb trees around it, about 2 miles from the city. We have finally decided on the spot where our house shall stand in case we decide to come, and you cannot, where running water or the seashore is wanting, find another more delightful spot for a residence. It is on an eminence, with a grove running up from the back to the very doors, another grove across the street in front, and fine openings through which distant hills and the richest landscapes appear. I have become somewhat acquainted with those ladies we shall have the most to do with, and find them intelligent, New England sort of folks. Indeed, this is a New England city in all its habits, and its inhabitants are more than half from New England. The second church, which is the best in the city, will give father a unanimous call to be their minister, with the understanding that he will give them what time he can spare from the seminary. I know of no place in the world where there is so fair a prospect of finding everything that makes social and domestic life pleasant. Uncle John and Uncle Samuel are just the intelligent, sociable, free, and hospitable sort of folk that everybody likes and everybody feels at home with. The folks are very anxious to have a school on our plan set on foot here. We can have fine rooms in the City College building, which is now unoccupied, and everybody is ready to lend a helping hand. As to Father, I never saw such a field of usefulness and influence as is offered to him here." End quote. This, then, was the field of labor in which the next 18 years of the life of Mrs. Stowe were to be passed. At this time her sister Mary was married and living in Hartford, her brothers Henry Ward and Charles were in college, while William and Edward, already licensed to preach, were preparing to follow their father to the West. Mr. Beecher's preliminary journey to Cincinnati was undertaken in the early spring of 1832, but he was not ready to remove his family until October of that year. An interesting account of this westward journey is given by Harriet in a letter sent back to Hartford from Cincinnati, as follows. Quote, "Well, my dear, the great sheet is out and the letter is begun. All our family are here in New York and in good health. Father is to perform tonight in the Chatham Theater, positively for the last time this season. I don't know, I'm sure, as we shall ever get to Pittsburgh. Father is staying here, begging money for the Biblical Literature professorship. The incumbent is to be C. Stowe. Last night we had a call from Arthur Tappan and Mr. Eastman. Father begged $2,000 yesterday, and now the good people are praying him to abide certain days, as he succeeds so well. They are talking of sending us off and keeping him here. I really dare not go and see Aunt Esther and Mother now. They were in the depths of tribulation before at staying so long, and now, in the lowest depths, another deep. Father is in high spirits. He is all in his own element, dipping into books, consulting authorities for his oration, going round here, there, everywhere, begging, borrowing, and spoiling the Egyptians, delighted with past success and confident for the future. Wednesday, still in New York. I believe it would kill me dead to live long in the way I have been doing since I have been here. It is a sort of agreeable delirium. There's only one thing about it. It is too scattering. I begin to be athirst for the waters of quietness." End quote. Writing from Philadelphia, she adds, quote, "Well, we did get away from New York at last, but it was through much tribulation. The truckman carried all the family baggage to the wrong wharf, and after waiting and waiting on board the boat, we were obliged to start without it, George remaining to look it up. Arrived here last Saturday evening, dull, drizzling weather, poor Aunt Esther in dismay, not a clean cap to put on, Mother in like state, all of us destitute. We went half to Dr. Skinner's and half to Mrs. Elms's. Mother, Aunt Esther, Father, and James to the former, Kate, Bella, and myself to Mr. Elms's. They are rich, hospitable folks, and act the part of Gaius in apostolic times. Our trunks came this morning. Father stood and saw them all brought into Dr. Skinner's entry, and then he swung his hat and gave a hurrah, as any man would whose wife had not had a clean cap or ruffle for a week. Father does not succeed very well in opening purses here. Mr. Eastman says, however, that this is not of much consequence. I saw today a notice in the Philadelphian about Father, setting forth how, quote, this distinguished brother with his large family, having torn themselves from the endearing scenes of their home, etc., etc., were going like Jacob, end quote, etc., a very scriptural and appropriate flourish. It is too much after the manner of men, or, as Paul says, speaking as a fool. A number of the pious people of this city are coming here this evening to hold a prayer meeting with reference to the journey and its object. For this I thank them." End quote. From Downington she writes, quote, "Here we all are, Noah and his wife and his sons and his daughters, with the cattle and creeping things, all dropped down in the front parlor of this tavern, about 30 miles from Philadelphia. If today is a fair specimen of our journey, it will be a very pleasant, obliging driver. good roads, good spirits, good dinner, fine scenery, and now and then some psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, for with George on board you may be sure of music of some kind. Moreover, George has provided himself with a quantity of tracts, and he and the children have kept up a regular discharge at all the wayfaring people we encountered. I tell him he is peppering the land with moral influence. We are all well, all in good spirits. Just let me give you a peep into our traveling household. Behold us, then, in the front parlor of this country inn, all as much at home as if we were in Boston. Father is still sitting opposite to me at this table, reading. Kate is writing a billet doux to Mary on a sheet like this. Thomas is opposite, writing in a little journal that he keeps. Sister Belle, too, has her little record. George is waiting for a seat that he may produce his paper and write. As for me, among the multitude of my present friends, my heart still makes occasional visits to absent ones, visits full of pleasure and full of cause of gratitude to him who gives us friends. I have thought of you often to-day, my G. We stopped this noon at a substantial Pennsylvania tavern, and among the flowers in the garden was a late monthly honeysuckle like the one at North Guilford. I made a spring for it, but George secured the finest bunch, which he wore in his buttonhole the rest of the noon. This afternoon, as we were traveling, we struck up and sang Jubilee. It put me in mind of the time when we used to ride along the rough North Guilford roads and make the air vocal as we went along. Pleasant times, those. Those were blue skies, and that was a beautiful lake, and noble pine trees and rocks they were that hung over it. But those we shall look upon no more. Well, my dear, there is a land where we shall not love and leave. Those skies shall never cease to shine. The waters of life we shall never be called upon to leave. We have here no continuing city, but we seek one to come. In such thoughts as these I desire ever to rest, and with such words as these let us comfort one another and edify one another. End quote. Harrisburg, Sunday evening. Quote, Mother and Esther, George, and the little folks have just gathered into Kate's room, and we have just been singing. Father has gone to preach for Mr. DeWitt. Tomorrow we expect to travel 62 miles, and in 2 more days shall reach Wheeling. There we shall take the steamboat to Cincinnati. End quote. On the same journey, George Beecher writes, quote, We had poor horses in crossing the mountains. Our average rate for the last 4 days to Wheeling was 44 miles. The journey which takes the mail stage 48 hours took us 8 days. At Wheeling we deliberated long whether to go on board a boat for Cincinnati, but the prevalence of the cholera there at last decided us to remain. While at Wheeling, Father preached 11 times, nearly every evening, and gave them the Taylorite heresy on sin and decrees to the highest notch, and what amused me most was to hear him establish it from the Confession of Faith. It went high and dry, however, above all objections, and they were delighted with it, even the old school men, since it had not been christened heresy in their hearing. After remaining in Wheeling 8 days, we chartered a stage for Cincinnati and started next morning. At Granville, Ohio, we were invited to stop and attend a protracted meeting. Being in no hurry to enter Cincinnati till the cholera had left, we consented. We spent the remainder of the week there, and I preached 5 times and Father 4. The interest was increasingly deep and solemn each day, and when we left there were 45 cases of conversion in the town, besides those from the surrounding towns. The people were astonished at the doctrine, said they never saw the truth so plain in their lives. End quote. Although the newcomers were cordially welcomed in Cincinnati, and everything possible was done for their comfort and to make them feel at home, they felt themselves to be strangers in a strange land. Their homesickness and yearnings for New England are set forth by the following extracts from Mrs. Stowe's answer to the first letter they received from Hartford after leaving there. Quote, My dear sister, Mary, The Hartford letter from all and sundry has just arrived, and after cutting all manner of capers expressive of thankfulness, I have skipped 3 stairs at a time up to the study to begin an answer. My notions of answering letters are according to the literal sense of the word, not waiting 6 months and then scrawling a lazy reply, but sitting down the moment you have read a letter and telling, as Dr. Wood says, how the subject strikes you. I wish I could be clear that the path of duty lay in talking to you this afternoon, but as I found a loud call to consider the heels of George's stockings, I must only write a word or 2 and then resume my darning needle. You don't know how anxiously we all have watched for some intelligence from Hartford. Not a day has passed when I have not been the efficient agent in getting somebody to the post office, and every day my heart has sunk at the sound of no letters. I felt a tremor quite sufficient for a lover when I saw your handwriting once more, so you see that in your old age you can excite quite as much emotion as did the admirable Miss Byron in her adoring Sir Charles. I hope the consideration and digestion of this fact will have its due weight in encouraging you to proceed. The fact of our having received said letter is as yet a state secret, not to be made known till all our family circle in full assembly meet at the tea-table. Then what an illumination! How we shall be edified and fructified, as that old Methodist said. It seems too bad to keep it from Mother and Aunt Esther the whole afternoon, but then I have the comfort of thinking that we are consulting for their greatest happiness on the whole, which is metaphysical benevolence. So kind Mrs. Parsons stopped in the very midst of her pumpkin pies to think of us? Seems to me I can see her bright, cheerful face now. And then those well-known handwritings. We do love our Hartford friends dearly. There can be, I think, no controverting that fact. Kate says the word love is used in 6 senses, and I am sure in some of them they will all come in. Well, good-bye for the present. Evening. Having finished the last hole on George's black vest, I stick in my needle and sit down to be sociable. You don't know how coming away from New England has sentimentalized us all. Never was there such an abundance of meditation on our native land, on the joys of friendship, the pains of separation. Catherine had an alarming paroxysm in Philadelphia, which expended itself in The Emigrant's Farewell. After this was sent off, she felt considerably relieved. My symptoms have been of a less acute kind, but, I fear, more enduring. There, the tea-bell rings. Too bad. I was just going to say something bright. Now to take your letter and run. How they will stare when I produce it. After tea. Well, we have had a fine time. When supper was about half over, Catherine began, "We have a dessert that we have been saving all the afternoon." And then I held up my letter. See here, this is from Hartford. I wish you could have seen Aunt Esther's eyes brighten, and Mother's pale face all in a smile, and Father as I unfolded the letter and began. Mrs. Parsons' notice of her Thanksgiving predicament caused just a laugh and then 1 or 2 sighs. I told you we were growing sentimental. We did talk some of keeping it, Thanksgiving, but perhaps we should all have felt something of the text, quote, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" End quote. Your praises of Aunt Esther I read twice in an audible voice, as the children made some noise the first time. I think I detected a visible blush, though she found at that time a great deal to do in spreading bread and butter for James and shuffling his plate, and indeed it was rather a vehement attack on her humility, since it gave her at least angelic perfection, if not Adamic, to use Methodist techniques. Jamie began his Sunday school career yesterday. The superintendent asked him how old he was. "I'm 4 years old now, and when it snows very hard I shall be 5, he answered. I have just been trying to make him interpret his meaning, but he says, "Oh, I said so because I could not think of anything else to say." By the by, Mary, speaking of the temptations of cities, I have much solicitude on Jamie's account, lest he should form improper intimacies, for yesterday or day before we saw him parading by the house with his arm over the neck of a great hog, apparently on the most amicable terms possible, and the other day he actually got upon the back of one and rode some distance. So much for allowing these animals to promenade on the streets, a particular in which Mrs. Cincinnati has imitated the domestic arrangements of some of her elder sisters, and a very disgusting one it is. Our family physician is one Dr. Drake, a man of a good deal of science, theory, and reputed skill, but a sort of general mark for the opposition of all the medical cloth of the city. He is a tall, rectangular, perpendicular sort of a body, as stiff as a poker, and enunciates his prescriptions very much as though he were delivering a discourse on the doctrine of election. The other evening he was detained from visiting Kate, and he sent a very polite, ceremonious note containing a prescription, with Dr. D.'s compliments to Miss Beecher, requesting that she would take the enclosed in a little molasses at 9 o'clock precisely. The house we are at present inhabiting is the most inconvenient, ill-arranged, good-for-nothing, and altogether to be execrated affair that ever was put together. It was evidently built without a thought of a winter season. The kitchen is so disposed that it cannot be reached from any part of the house without going out into the air. Mother is actually obliged to put on a bonnet and cloak every time she goes into it. In the house are 2 parlors with folding doors between them. The back parlor has but one window, which opens on a veranda, and has its lower half painted to keep out what little light there is. I need scarcely add that our landlord is an old bachelor, and of course acted up to the light he had, though he left little enough of it for his tenants." End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.